8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, May 10th, 1905. Snyder, Oklahoma Territory. Population somewhere between 900 and 1,100 souls, depending on who's counting. The town sits 40 miles northeast of the Red River in Kiowa County, built on land that belonged to the Kiowa and Comanche just 4 years earlier. The St. Louis and San Francisco Railway laid out most of the streets when they made Snyder a division point in 1902, naming it for Brian Snyder, their passenger traffic manager. 2 rail lines cross here. The town has wooden storefronts along Main Street, a hotel with a dry goods store on the first floor, a few dozen houses spreading west and north from the commercial district. It's spring in southwest Oklahoma. The air smells like recent rain and prairie grass. Heavy clouds have been hanging in the southwest for the past hour, high enough that people on the street are debating whether a storm will come at all. A fearful roaring begins just before 8. The sound carries from the southwest across the flat country, building for several minutes. Some who hear it think of a freight train, though the trains don't sound quite like that. Others recognize it as the noise of heavy hail. The roaring continues, growing louder. Then rain begins falling, hard and cold, with some hail mixed in. The rain lasts several minutes and stops almost as suddenly as it started. An ominous calm follows. The sky has gone dark. Not the darkness of normal nightfall, which came around 7:30, but something heavier, more complete. People stand in doorways listening. The roaring continues from the southwest. Lightning flashes. The electrical storm intensifies. Then the wind arrives. The damage path measures approximately 1/2 mile wide. Moving at 30 to 40 miles per hour, the tornado spends less than 1 minute on any given spot. It traverses the town of Snyder in under 3 minutes. When it lifts northeast of town shortly after 9 o'clock, 100 homes have been leveled. 150 more are badly damaged. The western and northern residential sections are gone. Some houses have been swept completely away, leaving only bare foundations. The official death toll will be recorded as 97. The actual number may never be known. Some estimates place it at 120 dead. That would be 10 to 12% of the entire population, one of the highest such ratios of any tornado in history. Most of the dead were at home when the storm struck, having finished their work for the day. The business district took major damage, but the worst destruction fell on the neighborhoods. This is not the story Americans tell themselves about the Wild West. This is not cowboys and outlaws, not cavalry charges or gunfights at noon. This is the documented reality that newspaper editors in 1905 struggled to describe, even with their formal Victorian prose and their willingness to print graphic details that would not pass modern standards of decorum. The headline in the Snyder Signal-Star, published 2 days after the disaster, read, "Most terrible storm and worse than war, which is hell." An ex-Union soldier who had survived Shiloh said he had never seen anything like this. A headline from the Mangum newspaper called it the most appalling visitation of nature ever visited upon a rural population in the history of the United States. These were not men prone to exaggeration. They were describing what they saw. The thesis here is simple and sobering. The American frontier killed far more people through natural disasters than through the violence we mythologize. Tornadoes, droughts, floods, blizzards, and disease-decimated communities throughout the plains and territories. The Snyder tornado of May 10, 1905, stands as Oklahoma's second deadliest tornado on record, surpassed only by the Woodward County disaster of April 9, 1947, which killed 181 people. In a single evening, in less than 5 minutes of contact time, a meteorological phenomenon erased a significant portion of a frontier town's population and destroyed most of its infrastructure. This happened not in some distant past, but in the early 20th century, in a community barely 3 years old, in territory that would not achieve statehood for another 2 years. Why does this matter? Because it reveals what the settlement of Oklahoma Territory actually looked like. Not the sanitized mythology of hardy pioneers taming the wilderness, but the brutal arithmetic of vulnerability. A town of roughly 1,000 people, built quickly with wood frame construction, lacking storm cellars for most residents, equipped with only telegraph and telephone lines for communication, both of which failed when needed most. No weather forecasting as we understand it, no warning system, no emergency response infrastructure. When disaster struck, survivors had to walk 3 miles to the nearest functioning telegraph at Mountain Park. From there, word spread by phone to Hobart, and from Hobart to the wider world. The response came by rail, with relief trains arriving from a dozen towns across Oklahoma Territory and beyond, carrying doctors, nurses, supplies, and coffins. The system worked, but slowly and only after the damage was complete. The evidence for this thesis comes from multiple documentary sources. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Snyder Signal-Star, the Daily Oklahoman, the Kansas City Star, the Galveston Tribune, and numerous other papers. Reports filed by C.M. Strong, Section Director for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Oklahoma Territory, published in the Monthly Weather Review for May and August 1905. Population figures from the 1907 census, taken after Oklahoma achieved statehood. Victim lists compiled by the Oklahoma Historical Society. Death certificates and cemetery records from Fair Lawn Cemetery outside Snyder. Eyewitness accounts collected by the National Weather Service's Norman office a century later. The scale of the disaster cannot be dismissed. 100 homes leveled, 150 damaged. At least 97 confirmed dead, likely more than 120 when accounting for unidentified victims buried in a mass grave. 150 injured. A town of perhaps 1,000 reduced by more than 10% in 3 minutes. Oklahoma Territory in 1905 was not yet a state. It would not join the Union until November 16, 1907. The western half of what would become Oklahoma had been organized as Oklahoma Territory by the Organic Act of 1890, while the eastern half remained Indian Territory. The Kiowa-Comanche-Apache Reservation, comprising roughly 2.5 million acres in the southwest, was opened to white settlement on August 6, 1901, following the Jerome Agreement of 1892 and subsequent congressional action. Each Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache head of household received an allotment of 160 acres. The remaining land, declared surplus, was opened by lottery rather than the chaotic land runs that had characterized earlier openings. Snyder was established in 1902, 1 year after the opening, built largely by the railroad on land that had been Kiowa and Comanche hunting grounds for generations. The broader meteorological context matters. May 1905 saw a multi-day tornado outbreak affecting Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. A strong low-pressure system developed over the Rocky Mountains near Denver, Colorado, on May 9th. A secondary low sat over Wyoming. Tornadoes formed across several plains, states that day. On May 10th, the Colorado system moved east toward the central and southern plains. A new trough of low pressure developed over the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles. Warm, moist air flowed north from the Gulf of Mexico. Dry air pushed east from the Rocky Mountains. The temperature contrasts, typical of May storm systems, added instability to an already volatile atmosphere. Supercell thunderstorms developed, capable of producing violent tornadoes. Multiple tornadoes touched down across Oklahoma Territory that evening. The Snyder tornado was the deadliest, but not the only one. The first tornado of the outbreak developed at 6:45 p.m. Central Standard Time near Carmel in Greer County, about 60 miles southwest of Snyder. This storm destroyed a home near Carmel, killing 3 members of the Hughes family. It continued northeast, growing to approximately 1 mile wide, and struck near the hamlet of Locke, about 7 miles south of Altus. The entire family of Frank James died. 4 members of the Ralston family were killed. A schoolhouse was destroyed. In total, at least 9 or 10 people died in Greer County before the storm crossed the Red River. Published victim lists account for names of 9 known dead in this area. The tornado lifted northeast of Locke, in what is now Jackson County but was then still part of Kiowa County. A second tornado, the one that would devastate Snyder, touched down just after 8 p.m. near the Kiowa-Greer County line. Some meteorological analysis suggests it may have merged with remnants of the first storm system. Others maintain they were distinct phenomena from the same supercell. The distinction matters less than the track. This tornado moved east-northeast, crossing the North Fork of the Red River near the mouth of Otter Creek. It followed close to Otter Creek, curving northeast through what is now northern Tillman County. At least 5 people were killed southwest of Snyder. Ray Moss, a tenant at the McCowan Ranch, died. 3 members of the Engel family perished. A woman identified only as Mrs. in contemporary accounts was among the dead. The town of Snyder had a population estimated at 900 to 1,100. Some newspaper accounts from immediately after the disaster claimed 2,500 inhabitants, but these figures were inflated, perhaps reflecting the railroad's promotional materials or confusion about the broader county population. The 1907 territorial census, taken 2 years after the tornado, counted 679 residents. Given the death toll and subsequent outmigration, it's reasonable to estimate Snyder's pre-tornado population somewhere between 900 and 1,100. The town occupied roughly 1 square mile, with the commercial district near the rail junction and residential areas spreading primarily to the west and north. Most buildings were wood-frame construction, built quickly and inexpensively. Some had storm cellars. Most did not. Dr. Charles Hibbard served as superintendent of Snyder Public Schools. He lived in town with his family. J.M. Egan was the station agent for the Frisco Railroad, formerly superintendent of Telegraph for the entire Frisco system and one of the best-known telegraphers in the American West. The town had 3 general stores, a blacksmith shop, a church that doubled as a school, and the Snyder Hotel, which stood above the dry goods store. The newspaper, the Snyder Signal-Star, operated from a building on Main Street. These details matter because they establish what existed before the tornado. They provide the baseline against which to measure loss. Eyewitness accounts describe the storm's approach with consistency. Heavy clouds in the southwest, high and unthreatening. Around 8 o'clock, a fearful roaring from the same direction. Heavy rainfall with some hail, the rain stopping suddenly. An ominous calm, then the tornado. Many accounts specify that no funnel cloud was visible from Snyder. The editor of the Signal-Star noted in his May 12th article that people were expressing opinions about whether rain would come, implying the threat was not obvious. The roaring gave some warning, but its meaning was ambiguous. 2 things caused that sound, the editor wrote. Either heavy hail or a cyclone. The rain and hail that followed suggested the former. Only when the rain stopped and the calm descended did the true danger become clear, and by then it was too late. Sunset occurred close to 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on May 10th. Twilight faded to full darkness between 8 and 8:30 as the storm approached. The tornado struck around 8:45 p.m. well after dark. This timing contributed significantly to the death toll. Survivors could not see the wreckage around them. They could not find the injured. They could not assess the damage. Darkness rendered familiar streets unrecognizable. The destruction was so complete that people climbing from cellars stood stunned, unable to orient themselves. Heavy rain followed the tornado, cold and drenching, making it nearly impossible to care for the injured. Fires broke out in the business district where lanterns and stoves had been overturned. The flames spread through debris made kindling by the wind. Survivors worked in the dark, in the rain, amid fire and wreckage, searching for the living and the dead. The damage path measured approximately 1/2 mile wide through Snyder. The tornado's forward speed was 30 to 40 miles per hour. At 1/2 mile wide and moving at 35 miles per hour, it would have taken the storm approximately 51 seconds to pass over any fixed point, less than 1 minute of wind. In that minute, homes were swept from foundations, walls collapsed, roofs peeled away. People were drawn back by the suction and cast aside behind where the vortex had picked them up. That last detail, mentioned in multiple accounts, suggests the tornado's rotation pulled debris and victims backward from its path before depositing them. Bodies were found behind where their houses had stood, not ahead of the storm track. The human toll defies easy categorization. Published victim lists contain partial or complete names of 86 known dead from Snyder and the surrounding area of Kiowa County. Adding the 9 known victims in Greer County from the first tornado brings the documented count to 95. The official National Weather Service figure of 97 appears to account for 2 additional deaths. But newspaper accounts from immediately after the disaster cite higher numbers. The Galveston Tribune reported estimates of 200 to 400 killed or injured combined. The Daily Ardmority in Oklahoma cited 100 dead. 2 distinguished Oklahoma historians later placed the count at about 120. An unknown number of unidentified victims were buried in a mass grave at Fair Lawn Cemetery outside Snyder. A stone marker placed in the 1990s commemorates 34 unknown men, women, and children who perished. If we accept 120 as the total, subtract 9 from Greer County, we arrive at 111 deaths from the Snyder tornado itself. Roughly 10 to 12% of the town's population killed in less than 3 minutes. Dr. Charles Hibbard, the school superintendent, died in the storm along with members of his family. J.M. Egan, the railroad agent, was killed. The lists contain names like Moss, Engel, Hughes, James, Ralston. Some entries read only unidentified child or unknown woman. The victims were covered with a coating of black slime, making identification difficult. The tornado had sucked up water from Otter Creek and the ponds along its path, along with the black mud from the creek bottom. This mixture was spread over the victims, giving them what one account described as a hideous and repulsive appearance. Bodies were so disfigured and covered that family members could not recognize their own dead. The immediate response reveals the limitations of frontier infrastructure. Both telegraph and telephone lines from Snyder were down. The railroad tracks were intact, but the station and telegraph were destroyed. Survivors faced 3 options: wait until morning and hope someone noticed the town had gone silent, try to repair the telegraph or telephone lines in the dark and rain, or send messengers on foot to the nearest functioning communication point. They chose the third option. Messengers walked 3 miles north to Mountain Park. The telephone lines were still functional there. From Mountain Park, word was sent by phone to Hobart, 9 miles to the northeast. From Hobart, the news spread by telegraph to neighboring towns and to the outside world. The first messages went out late on the night of May 10th. By the morning of May 11th, relief efforts were underway across Oklahoma Territory and beyond. The response, once mobilized, was comprehensive. Relief trains departed from Hobart, Frederick, Chickasha, Vernon, Davidson, El Dorado, Quanah, Oklahoma City, Mangum, Altus, Lawton, and several other towns. These trains carried doctors, nurses, recovery volunteers, and supplies. They arrived every few minutes through the night of May 10th and all day on May 11th. In Oklahoma City, the Funeral Directors Association was holding a convention. When Hal Street, a prominent undertaker, heard news of the catastrophe, he called for volunteers. 10 undertakers responded immediately. They departed Oklahoma City at 9 o'clock on the morning of May 11th aboard a special Frisco train, bringing a carload of coffins. The Territorial Engineering Corps, under Captain King, arrived to maintain order and assist with debris removal. The territorial government coordinated supplies and personnel. The response worked, but it took time, and in the hours immediately after the storm, survivors were on their own. The May 12, 1905 edition of the Snyder Signal Star, printed in Frederick because the newspaper's own press was buried under debris and the editor's home was serving as a hospital for 3 of the injured, contains a lengthy account of those first hours. The article notes that those who survived crept from storm cellars or emerged from houses that had somehow been spared. They stood stunned and dazed. When they began searching, they found horror. One witness reported never hearing a sob, cry, or groan from the crowd of afflicted. Even those who had lost family members were dry-eyed, talking dully and calmly of their loss. This detail suggests shock so profound it suppressed normal grief responses. The description comes from someone who arrived soon after the disaster and observed the survivors' behavior firsthand. The meteorological details, such as they exist, come primarily from C.M. Strong, Section Director for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Oklahoma Territory. His reports, published in the Monthly Weather Review, provide what little professional analysis exists from 1905. Strong noted that the tornado apparently originated in the valley of the Red River, forming in full force over the ridge of Gypsum Hills, about 12 miles west and 9 miles south of Olustee, Oklahoma. Contemporary observers were not familiar with supercell structure or cyclic tornado production. They described what they saw in terms they understood. A huge smoke hanging tail down from the clouds, wiggling along as if seeking to fasten onto everything in its track. The deep roar heard for half an hour before the storm struck, the frightful electrical storm. These descriptions match what modern meteorology would expect from a violent tornado in a supercell thunderstorm, but the 1905 observers lacked the framework to interpret them as such. The Fujita scale would not be developed until 1971, so no contemporary rating exists. Later analysis retroactively rated the Snyder tornado as F5, the highest category, based on the severity of damage. Homes swept completely from foundations. Ground scouring reported. Incredible phenomena recorded. Posts driven full of straws as if the straws were nails. A thin piece of shingle driven deep into the corner of the Signal Star building like iron. These are the classic signatures of extreme wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. The F5 rating places Snyder among the most violent tornadoes in recorded American history. At the time it occurred, it was the second deadliest F5 on record, after the New Richmond, Wisconsin tornado of June 12, 1899, which killed 117. The Snyder tornado held that position until the Woodward County disaster of 1947. The disaster unfolded across southwest Oklahoma Territory, not just in Snyder. Another tornado from a different supercell struck Elk City in Beckham County, killing 2. That same storm continued northeast to Quinlan, Oklahoma, about 2 hours northeast of Snyder, killing 3 more. The entire outbreak produced at least 4 documented tornadoes across a swath of territory roughly 100 miles wide. Total deaths approached 125 to 130 when all locations are accounted for. The event stands as one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in Oklahoma history, though the Snyder tornado alone accounts for the vast majority of fatalities. The recovery took months. The rebuilding took years. The town never fully recovered its pre-tornado. Population. The 1907 census counted 679 residents, down from an estimated 900 to 1,100 before the disaster. Some of this decline represents deaths. The rest represents people who left, who decided they could not or would not rebuild in a place that had taken so much. The 1910 census showed 1,122, suggesting some recovery. By 1920 and 1930, the population stabilized around 1,200. It has never exceeded 1,900. The 2000 census counted 1,509. The 2010 count was 1,394. The town exists, functions, serves its agricultural hinterland. But it carries the demographic scar of May 10, 1905, visible in its size relative to other southwestern Oklahoma communities founded around the same time. Two fires, in 1906 and 1909, destroyed most of the remaining wooden structures along Main Street. Whether these fires resulted from ongoing structural damage from the tornado or from unrelated causes is unclear, but their timing suggests the former. The wooden buildings that survived the tornado were weakened, their joints stressed, their framing compromised. They would have been more susceptible to fire than new construction. The town rebuilt in brick. Of all the structures standing in Snyder in May 1905, only two survived to the present day. One is the building that housed the Snyder Hotel on the top floor and the dry goods store below. Photographs from May 1905 show it damaged but standing. Photographs from April 2005 show it still there, a century later, one of two witnesses to what happened. Fairlawn Cemetery, outside Snyder, contains a mass grave. The exact location was uncertain by the 1990s when the marker was placed. Local memory and cemetery records suggested a general area. The stone reads, "In memory of the 34 unknown men, women, and children who perished in the cyclone of May 10, 1905. 34 unidentified dead from a town of roughly 1,000. Some may have been transients, railroad workers, ranch hands passing through. Others were likely residents whose bodies were too damaged for identification, whose family members were also dead, who had no one left to claim them." The mass grave represents the administrative reality of frontier disaster. When you have more dead than you can identify, and limited time before decomposition in May heat, and no refrigeration, you bury them together and mark the spot as best you can. The broader context of Oklahoma Territory weather in the early 20th century matters. Settlers understood they lived in a dangerous climate. Tornadoes were called cyclones. They were feared and discussed. If a funnel was spotted, someone would ring a church bell to alert the community. More often, tornadoes struck without warning. The Chandler tornado of March 30, 1897, killed 14 people in Lincoln County. The Oklahoma City tornado of May 12, 1896, killed 2. These were not isolated incidents. The Central and Southern Plains in spring produce more tornadoes than anywhere else on Earth. Warm Gulf air meeting cold Rocky Mountain, air meeting dry southwestern air creates instability. Add May's temperature contrasts and the jet stream's position, and you generate supercells. Oklahoma sits in what meteorologists would later call Tornado Alley, though that term did not exist in 1905. What did exist was experience, passed down through stories. One of the more persistent tales surrounding Snyder involves Kiowa warnings. According to this account, several Kiowa told the white settlers to move their town to a nearby secluded valley. The Kiowa maintained that a tornado had destroyed an Indian village on the exact site of Snyder years earlier, and that anyone who lived there would meet the same fate. Most settlers dismissed this as a scare tactic designed to discourage settlement. The story found its way into newspapers after the 1905 disaster. An old Indian resident, the accounts say, claimed a windstorm worse than the 1905 tornado had passed over the same spot 20 years earlier, around 1885. Whether this story represents actual Kiowa oral history or post-disaster myth-making is impossible to verify, but it underscores a truth. The Kiowa had lived on this land for generations. They knew its weather. They had survived its tornadoes. Their knowledge was dismissed by settlers who believed they knew better. The weather on May 10, 1905 followed a pattern anyone familiar with plain spring could recognize. Morning clear, afternoon clouds building, evening instability. The low pressure over Colorado, the secondary low over Wyoming, the warm Gulf moisture, the temperature contrasts, all the ingredients were present, But without modern forecasting, without radar, without satellite imagery, without communication networks that could track storms as they developed, the settlers in Snyder had no way to know what was forming southwest of them until they heard the roar. By then, it was too late. The death toll analysis requires careful attention to sources. The National Weather Service officially lists 97. This figure comes from Thomas Grzoulis's comprehensive work, Significant Tornadoes, 1680–1991, published in 1993, which itself drew from contemporary newspaper accounts and Weather Bureau records. Brooks and Doswell's 2000 study Normalized Damage from Major Tornadoes, 1890–1999, uses the same 97 figure, but contemporary newspapers show variation. The Galveston Tribune on May 11th reported 200 to 400 killed and injured combined, not distinguishing between categories. The Daily Ardmort on May 12th reported 100 dead. The Oklahoma Historical Society, citing two distinguished historians whose names are not specified in the available records, places the count at about 120. If 97 is the documented count from verified victim lists and 120 represents the historical estimate, accounting for unidentified and missing victims, the true toll likely falls between these numbers. Call it 110, plus or minus 10. The medical response tells us something about frontier healthcare infrastructure. Multiple doctors arrived on relief trains from surrounding towns. They worked in makeshift facilities, treating the injured under primitive conditions. No antibiotics, limited anesthetics, surgery by lantern light. The injured who survived the initial trauma still faced infection risk, shock, internal injuries that would not be diagnosed until symptoms appeared days later. The 150 injured figure represents those who survived long enough to be counted. It does not include those who died of their injuries in the following days or weeks, who might or might not have been added to the official death toll depending on how and where they died. A peculiarity noted in multiple accounts concerns the behavior of the tornado's winds. Victims were not carried forward with the storm but drawn back by the suction and deposited behind where they were picked up. This suggests the tornado's rotational winds created a backward draft relative to the storm's forward motion. Bodies found behind their former homes, debris scattered in patterns that did not match the storm track. These details confused observers in 1905 but make sense in light of modern understanding of vortex dynamics. The tornado's circulation, rotating at extreme speed, would pull objects into its core and then centrifuge them outward and backward relative to the storm's movement. The effect was to scatter victims over a wider area than the damage path, complicating search and recovery efforts. The territorial response deserves examination. Oklahoma Territory in 1905 had no formal disaster response agency. No FEMA, no National Guard in the modern sense, no coordinated emergency management. What it had was the Territorial Engineering Corps, railroad infrastructure, telegraph and telephone networks, and a culture of mutual aid among communities. When word reached the governor's office in Guthrie, roughly 120 miles northeast of Snyder, the territorial government coordinated with the railroad to expedite relief trains. The Frisco Railroad, which owned much of Snyder's infrastructure, dispatched personnel and supplies. The Territorial Engineering Corps provided military discipline and organization, but most of the response came from individual communities mobilizing independently. Hobart sent the first train. Frederick sent supplies. Chickasha sent doctors. Oklahoma City sent the undertakers. This was not centralized disaster management. This was frontier improvisation, effective but limited. The question of warning systems matters. In 1905, weather forecasting meant observing current conditions and making educated guesses about what might develop. The U.S. Weather Bureau had section offices in major cities. They issued forecasts based on barometric, pressure, temperature, wind direction, and reports from other stations. They could say a region was favorable for severe weather. They could not track individual storms in real time or predict tornado touchdowns. Even if forecasters in Oklahoma City or Fort Worth had known a supercell was forming southwest of Snyder, they had no way to warn the town specifically. The telegraph would have reached the station agent, but he died in the storm. The church bell might have been rung, but by whom and based on what information? The cultural response reveals period attitudes toward natural disaster. Newspaper language from May 1905 treats the tornado as a visitation, a judgment, an act of God or nature personified as demon or destroyer. The Signal Star headline calling it worse than war reflects Civil War memory, still fresh 40 years after Appomattox. The reference to Shiloh, one of the bloodiest battles, places the tornado's horror in a framework readers would understand. The Mangum papers claim that this was the most appalling visitation of nature ever visited upon a rural population in American history, was hyperbolic but not absurdly so. For Oklahoma Territory in 1905, this was unprecedented. Larger death tolls had occurred elsewhere, but not in their region, not in their experience, not in living memory. The economic impact extended beyond Snyder. The town was a railroad division point, meaning it serviced and coordinated trains for the entire Juana division of the Frisco system. Loss of the station, the agent, the telegraph, the yards, disrupted operations across a wide area. Farmers who shipped cattle through Snyder had to find alternative routes. Ranchers who bought supplies in Snyder's stores went elsewhere. The town's function as a regional hub was compromised. Some of that traffic returned as rebuilding progressed. Some never came back. Towns like Hobart and Frederick, larger and better established, absorbed some of Snyder's economic role. This partly explains why Snyder never grew beyond its pre-tornado size. The myth of the hardy pioneer underestimates the vulnerability these people faced. A town of 1,000 with wood frame construction, minimal public infrastructure, no warning systems, limited medical care, and communications that required walking 3 miles to send a telegram. When disaster struck, survival depended on being in the right place, having a storm cellar, being underground when the wind hit. Everything else was chance. The sturdy pioneer mythos suggests people triumphed through grit and determination. The reality is they died by the hundreds in disasters like Snyder, and those who survived did so often through luck, then rebuilt because they had no alternative. The tornado's track, as reconstructed from damage surveys and eyewitness reports, extended roughly 40 miles from its formation southwest of Olustee to its dissipation northeast of Snyder. At 1/2 mile wide, that represents 20 square miles of path. Within that path, intensity varied. The worst damage, the F5 level destruction, occurred in Snyder and on a few farms southwest of town. Other areas along the path saw F2 or F3 damage, significant but survivable. The variation reflects the tornado structure. Maximum winds in the core, lesser winds in the outer circulation. Homes directly in the path were destroyed. Homes a 1/4 mile away might lose only roofs or porches. This is why 100 homes were leveled and 150 damaged. The leveled homes took direct hits. The damaged homes were near the edge of the path. The Fairlawn Cemetery mass grave, that stone marking 34 unknowns, represents one of the most haunting aspects of the disaster. 34 people who lived in or near Snyder in May 1905, whose names we do not know, whose families we cannot trace, who died in the tornadoes and were buried together because no one could say who they were. Some probably were identified at first, but later records were lost. Fires in 1906 and 1909 destroyed records along with buildings. The Signal Star's office was damaged in the tornado. Records kept in private homes burned or blew away. The ability to trace victims depended on surviving documentation, and much of that documentation did not survive. The 34 unknowns are a floor, not a ceiling. There may have been more. The 120 figure from the Oklahoma Historical Society. Historians matters because these were professional researchers working decades after the event, with access to sources no longer available. Their estimate presumably accounted for discrepancies between published lists and contemporary accounts, for missing persons never found, for deaths in the days and weeks following that might not have been officially attributed to the tornado. 120 would represent a death rate of 12% if we assume a population of 1,000, 10% if we assume 1,100. Either figure represents catastrophic loss for a small community. For comparison, the 1918 influenza pandemic killed roughly 2% of the U.S. population. Snyder lost 6 times that proportion in 3 minutes. The rebuilding tells us what frontier resilience actually meant. Not stubborn refusal to acknowledge danger, but pragmatic assessment of options. Those who stayed did so because they had invested in land, in businesses, in homes and buildings now destroyed, but still representing sunk costs. Starting over elsewhere meant abandoning that investment. Rebuilding meant salvaging something from loss. Insurance was limited. Federal disaster relief did not exist in 1905. The territorial government coordinated the immediate response but provided no long-term recovery funds. People rebuilt with their own money, with loans from regional banks, with help from relatives, with whatever they could scrape together. The brick buildings that replaced the wooden ones were partly pragmatic, cheaper to insure and partly symbolic monuments to endurance. The school system continued. Dr. Hibbard was dead, along with his family. Someone else became superintendent. Children who survived returned to class. New families moved in, drawn by railroad jobs and available land. Life continued because it had to, because stopping was not an option, because the frontier offered no safety net and no alternative. This is not inspiring. This is survival as grinding necessity, the kind that leaves demographic scars visible a century later in census tables. The Kiowa-Comanche connection cannot be ignored. Snyder sat on land taken from the Kiowa and Comanche 4 years before the tornado. The Indian Appropriation Act, the Jerome Agreement, the allotment process, all of it happened between 1892 and 1901. The white settlers who died in Snyder in 1905 were living on land the Kiowa had warned them about, if the stories are true. Whether the Kiowa warnings represented actual knowledge of prior tornadoes or were invented after the fact is unknowable. But the broader pattern is clear. The Kiowa and Comanche had lived on the southern plains for generations. They knew its weather, its dangers, its rhythms. They had adapted their lifeways to accommodate tornado risk, building portable dwellings that could be abandoned quickly, living in dispersed bands rather than concentrated towns, moving with the seasons. The white settlers built permanent towns, concentrated populations, wooden structures that became death traps in high winds. They replicated Eastern building patterns in a Western environment that demanded different solutions. The tornado punished that miscalculation. The atmospheric conditions on May 10, 1905, were textbook for violent tornado development. Low pressure over Colorado, secondary low over Wyoming, both systems moving east toward the Central Plains. Warm Gulf air pushing north, cold, dry air from the Rockies pushing east. The resulting instability, quantified in modern terms as high Cape values and significant wind shear, created ideal conditions for supercells. Multiple tornadoes formed. The one that struck Snyder was part of a family of tornadoes from the same parent storm, a cyclic supercell producing successive vortices along its track. This phenomenon is now well understood. In 1905, it was mystery wrapped in catastrophe, explained as divine judgment or natural malevolence. The May and August 1905 issues of Monthly Weather Review contain the closest thing we have to official meteorological documentation. C.M. Strong's reports describe the storm track, the damage, the weather conditions. They do not speculate about causes in modern meteorological terms because the science did not yet exist. They document, describe, record. The value of these reports for historical analysis is immense. They provide contemporaneous professional observation, free from later myth-making or memory distortion. Strong saw the aftermath, interviewed survivors, traced the path, recorded the details. His reports, dry and technical, offer ground truth against which other accounts can be measured. The railroad's role deserves attention. The St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, commonly called the Frisco, built Snyder as a division point. They laid out the town, erected key buildings, established the station and yards. When the tornado destroyed their infrastructure, they rebuilt. They had to. Snyder was not just a town to the Frisco. It was a functional node in their network. Without Snyder, trains had to run through to other division points, increasing wear on equipment, complicating scheduling, reducing efficiency. The railroad's self-interest aligned with the town's survival. This alignment drove much of the rebuilding. The Frisco provided materials, labor, loans, expertise. They needed Snyder operational. The town benefited from that need. The question of whether the death toll was 97 or 120 might seem like statistical hair-splitting, but it represents the difference between 10% and 12% of the population. It represents the difference between a documented disaster and a catastrophe that exceeded contemporary recording capacity. The missing dead, if they existed, were people too marginal to be named, too isolated to be counted, too damaged to be identified. They matter not as numbers, but as testimony to the limits of frontier administration. When disaster outpaced bureaucracy's ability to count bodies, people fell through gaps. The mass grave at Fair Lawn Cemetery is where those gaps are buried. The comparative context places Snyder in perspective. The deadliest tornado in U.S. history remains the tri-state tornado of March 18, 1925, which killed at least 695 people across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. The second deadliest is the Natchez, Mississippi tornado of May 7, 1840, which killed at least 317. The New Richmond, Wisconsin tornado of June 12, 1899 killed 117. Snyder, with 97 to 120, ranks somewhere between 15th and 20th deadliest, depending on the count used. Within Oklahoma, only Woodward exceeds it. For a town of 1,000 to generate a death toll comparable to disasters in cities of 5 or 10,000 speaks to exceptional vulnerability combined with exceptional violence. The relief trains deserve their own accounting. Starting late on May 10th and continuing through May 11th, trains arrived from Hobart at 9 miles away, Frederick at 15 miles, Chickasha at 40 miles, Altus at 35 miles, Lawton at 40 miles, Mangum at 35 miles, Oklahoma City at 90 miles, and beyond. Each train carried doctors, nurses, volunteers, supplies. The coordinated response happened without central direction, organized through telegraph and telephone networks among station agents and town officials. This was distributed decision-making at frontier speed, effective because the participants shared assumptions about mutual obligation and because the rail network provided the physical infrastructure to move people and goods quickly. Without the railroad, relief would have taken days instead of hours. The railroad that built Snyder also saved it. The Territorial Engineering Corps role is less documented but no less important. Captain King and his men provided order when civilian authority had collapsed. They cleared debris, secured buildings, prevented looting, coordinated recovery work. Their presence represented territorial government's most immediate contribution. Not money, not long-term planning, but boots on the ground, discipline, organization. This was the closest thing Oklahoma Territory had to a National Guard, and their rapid deployment suggests the territorial governor understood the severity and responded appropriately within the limits of available resources. The injuries, 150 documented, tell their own story. Broken bones from flying debris, lacerations from glass and wood splinters, concussions from impacts, internal injuries from being thrown or crushed, burns from fires, exposure to cold rain while injured, shock from trauma and loss. Medical treatment in 1905 meant morphine for pain, basic wound care, splinting fractures, hoping for the best. Many of the injured would have died in later years once infections set in. Antibiotics would not be discovered until 1928. Tetanus from dirty wounds was common and often fatal. Some of the 150 injured probably died in the following weeks and may or may not be included in the death toll, depending on how records were kept. The fires in the business district, mentioned in multiple accounts, complicated rescue work. Overturned lanterns and stoves ignited debris. Fires spread through wreckage packed tight by the wind. Water mains were broken. Firefighting equipment was destroyed. Volunteers formed bucket brigades, drawing water from intact wells and cisterns. The heavy rain helped, dampening some fires, but others burned through the night. Fires in disaster zones are particularly dangerous because injured people cannot flee, and rescuers must choose between fighting fires and searching wreckage. The accounts do not specify how many victims died in fires versus directly from the tornado, but fires clearly increased the death toll. The cultural aftermath extended beyond Snyder. Every small town in Oklahoma Territory understood it could be next. Snyder was not special, not cursed, not uniquely vulnerable. It was ordinary, and that made it terrifying. If an ordinary town on ordinary land on an ordinary May evening could lose 10% of its population in 3 minutes, nowhere was safe. This realization drove some to leave Oklahoma Territory. Others stayed but built storm cellars, concrete or stone chambers underground where families could shelter. By the 1920s and 1930s, most rural Oklahoma homes had storm cellars. That infrastructure, built in response to disasters like Snyder, saved countless lives in later tornadoes. The school naming provides an odd postscript. Snyder High School's athletic teams are called the Cyclones. This choice, made at some point after the disaster, represents either dark humor, defiant reclamation, or simple acknowledgement of defining reality. The tornado shaped Snyder's history. The town's identity cannot be separated from what happened in May 1905. Naming the school teams the Cyclones accepts that fact, incorporates it, makes it part of ongoing life rather than suppressed trauma. Whether this is healthy or macabre depends on perspective. It is honest. The broader narrative of frontier settlement treats disasters as footnotes. The overland trail deaths from disease and accident. The droughts that forced homesteaders off their claims. The blizzards that killed cattle and people. The floods that washed away towns. These appear as occasional setbacks in a story of progress and triumph. But aggregate the numbers and a different picture emerges. More people died from natural disasters and disease on the frontier than from conflict with Native Americans, outlaws, or each other. The myth emphasizes violence because violence makes better stories. The reality emphasizes vulnerability because vulnerability was the actual threat. Snyder, Oklahoma Territory, on May 10, 1905, embodied that vulnerability. A town of 1,000 on land taken from people who knew its dangers, built with inadequate structures, lacking warning systems or shelters, connected to the wider world by technologies that failed when needed most. When the tornado struck, survival was luck. Recovery was necessity. Memory is complicated. The official death toll of 97 understates the loss. The probable death toll of 120 better captures it. The unknown 34 buried at Fairlawn Cemetery represent the limit of documentation. Behind all these numbers are people whose names we know or don't know. whose lives ended in 3 minutes of wind, whose deaths shaped a town's trajectory for the next century. The Snyder tornado was not the worst natural disaster in American history. It was not the worst tornado in Oklahoma history. It ranks second in the state, 15th to 20th nationally. But for the people of Snyder on May 10, 1905, it was the worst thing they had experienced or would experience. The survivors' shock, their dry-eyed calm, their inability to grieve normally, all suggest trauma beyond processing capacity. The town rebuilt because people had no choice. Some left, some stayed. Life continued. The demographic scar remains visible in census data. The mass grave remains at Fairlawn. The 2 buildings that survived stand as witnesses. American frontier history is incomplete without accounting for disasters like Snyder. The westward movement killed people through violence, yes, but also through exposure, disease, starvation, and weather. The tornado that struck Snyder was not random. It was the product of atmospheric conditions that recur every spring on the southern plains. The Kiowa and Comanche knew this. They adapted. The white settlers either did not know or chose not to believe. They built permanent towns in tornado zones and hoped for the best. Sometimes hope worked. Sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the results looked like Snyder. The documentation that survives from May 1905 reveals patterns in how frontier communities processed catastrophe. The Snyder signal star, despite having its press buried under debris, managed to publish a special edition on May 12th, printed in Frederick. This was not journalistic ambition. This was survival instinct. Towns needed newspapers to function. News of the disaster had to reach relatives in other states, potential investors, territorial authorities, insurance companies. The newspaper served as the town's voice to the outside world. Without that voice, Snyder risked being forgotten, passed over in relief efforts, written off as finished. The Signal Star's continued publication declared that Snyder still existed, still mattered, still intended to survive. The act of printing a newspaper 2 days after losing 120 residents was pragmatic defiance. The editor's decision to print in Frederick rather than wait for his own press to be excavated reveals the urgency. Frederick had working presses, working typesetting equipment, paper stock, ink, skilled printers. The Snyder editor likely walked or took a wagon the 15 miles to Frederick, carrying his handwritten account of the disaster. Frederick printers set the type, ran the press, produced copies. Some of those copies went back to Snyder for local distribution. Others went to newspaper exchanges in Oklahoma City, Kansas City, Fort Worth, Denver, St. Louis, Chicago, New York. Within a week, accounts of the Snyder tornado appeared in papers across the United States. This communication network, built on reciprocal newspaper exchanges and telegraph transmission of urgent news, spread word faster than any official government channels could have managed. The language used in these newspaper accounts matters. Terms like cyclone instead of tornado reflect period usage. The Weather Bureau officially distinguished between the two, defining cyclones as rotating low-pressure systems and tornadoes as violent rotating columns of air. But popular usage treated them as synonyms. When the Signal Star called it a cyclone, readers understood tornado. The choice of visitation to describe the disaster carries theological weight. A visitation from God or nature, implying agency and intention. This language appears throughout 1905 accounts. The tornado was not merely a meteorological event. It was judgment, test, punishment, or incomprehensible malice from forces beyond human control. This framing helped survivors process what had happened. Random chance killing 120 people made no sense. Divine will or natural law at least provided a framework, however inadequate. The comparison to war, specifically the statement that the tornado was worse than war, which is hell, deserves unpacking. This comes from the Signal Star's May 12th headline. The editor or writer who chose those words lived in Oklahoma Territory in 1905, 40 years after Appomattox. Civil War memory still shaped American culture. Veterans of that war were in their 60s and 70s, still alive, still vocal. The reference to Shiloh, one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles, came from an identified ex-Union soldier who toured the Snyder wreckage. For him to say he had seen nothing like this since Shiloh carried immense weight. Shiloh killed roughly 3,600 combined Union and Confederate soldiers over 2 days in April 1862. It was carnage on an industrial scale, trenches and artillery and massed rifle fire. For a Shiloh veteran to claim Snyder was worse suggests the specific horror he encountered. Not the absolute body count, which was far lower at Snyder, but the nature of the deaths. War killed soldiers, mostly men, mostly armed, mostly expecting combat. The tornado killed families, children, women, elderly, people at home eating dinner or reading or sleeping. The randomness and totality of destruction, homes erased from foundations, bodies mutilated and covered in mud. The darkness and rain and fire all combined to create a scene the veteran found more disturbing than Shiloh. The detail about victims being covered in black slime from Otter Creek appears in multiple independent accounts, suggesting accuracy. The tornado's passage over Otter Creek and the ponds along its path sucked up water and bottom mud. This mixture, spread over victims, served as both physical marker and symbolic contamination. Survivors searching for family members could not recognize faces. Identification required clothing remnants, jewelry, body size and shape, location where found. This added psychological trauma to physical disaster. Finding a body is one thing. Finding a body so disfigured you cannot tell if it's your spouse or your neighbor is qualitatively worse. Some identifications were probably wrong. A woman's body found in the ruins of a particular house, assumed to be the house's occupant, might have been a visitor or a neighbor blown from elsewhere. Without fingerprinting, without dental records, without any modern identification methods, frontier authorities relied on circumstantial evidence and best guesses. The 34 unknowns at Fairlawn represent cases where even guessing failed. The railroad division point function of Snyder explains much about its founding and its survival. A division point was where locomotives were serviced, crews changed, trains were assembled and disassembled. The Frisco needed these points spaced along its routes to maintain efficient operations. Snyder sat at a strategic location, roughly 90 miles northeast of the Red River border with Texas, 40 miles from Hobart, 45 from Lawton. It served as a hub for the Juana Division, managing traffic through southwest Oklahoma Territory. The railroad invested heavily in division point infrastructure. Roundhouses for locomotive maintenance, water towers, coal yards, switching equipment, telegraph offices, crew quarters, freight warehouses. When the tornado destroyed this infrastructure, the railroad's investment disappeared. But so did the functional capacity. Trains still needed servicing, crews still needed relief, freight still needed sorting. The railroad could bypass Snyder temporarily, running locomotives longer distances, housing crews elsewhere, but this increased costs and reduced efficiency. The railroad had strong incentive to rebuild Snyder quickly and thoroughly. This incentive translated into direct investment, materials, labor, technical expertise, loans to local businesses. The railroad rebuilt Snyder because Snyder served the railroad's needs. This dynamic explains why some frontier towns survived disasters, while others didn't. Towns with functional economic justification, with railroads or mines or processing facilities or territorial administrative roles, had institutional backing for recovery. Towns that existed primarily as speculative ventures, real estate schemes, or service points for surrounding farms had less backing. If such a town suffered catastrophe, investors might write it off and try elsewhere. Snyder survived partly because the Frisco needed it to survive. The town's population never recovered to pre-tornado levels, but it stabilized and continued. That outcome represents partial success in frontier terms. Total success would have been growth. Total failure would have been abandonment. Snyder achieved survival, which was enough. The territorial government's response, coordinated from Guthrie through telegraph and telephone networks, shows frontier administration operating at capacity. The Territorial Engineering Corps deployment, the coordination of relief trains, the communication with county officials, all happened within hours of receiving word. This efficiency suggests pre-existing plans or at least understood protocols for disaster response. Oklahoma Territory in 1905 had experienced multiple catastrophes. Tornadoes were regular occurrences. Prairie fires destroyed property and killed livestock. Droughts caused crop failures. Floods washed out bridges and rail lines. Territorial authorities had developed informal disaster response capacity through experience. When Snyder happened, they knew what to do. Not perfectly, not with the resources they needed, but competently within frontier limitations. This represents institutional learning, the slow accumulation of practical knowledge about managing catastrophe in a resource-limited environment. The mass grave's uncertain location by the 1990s, requiring a commemorative marker placed near the alleged site, tells its own story about memory and documentation. 90 years after the tornado, local memory had faded. People who knew exactly where the bodies were buried had died. Records, if they existed, were lost or incomplete. Cemetery maps might have shown a section designated for tornado victims, but not the specific plot. The mass grave might not have been a single large pit, but several smaller ones, or a section of graves without individual markers. By 1995, or whenever the marker was placed, authorities had to rely on best estimates. The marker's wording near the alleged site acknowledges this uncertainty while still honoring the dead. It represents frontier disaster's long tail, the immediate death toll. The decades of incomplete records, the eventual commemoration based on fragmentary evidence. The 34 unknown victims remain unknown, their graves' location approximate at best. The demographic analysis of Snyder's population trajectory from 1905 through 2010 reveals the tornado's lasting impact. Pre-tornado estimates range from 900 to 1,100. The 1907 census counted 679, suggesting population loss of roughly 25 to 40%. Some of this loss was deaths. 100 to 120 dead from a population of 1,000 represents 10 to 12% immediate mortality. But the remaining 13 to 28% population loss represents outmigration. People who left because they couldn't rebuild, because they'd lost everything, because they feared another tornado, because they saw no future in Snyder. The 1910 census showed 1,122, suggesting partial recovery. New families moved in, drawn by railroad jobs and available homestead land. But the town never exceeded its pre-tornado peak. The 1920 census counted 1,197. The 1930 census showed 1,195. Through the mid-20th century, Snyder stabilized around 1,200 residents. This plateau represents the town's carrying capacity under prevailing economic conditions. The tornado didn't prevent recovery to pre-disaster levels. It prevented growth beyond those levels. Towns like Hobart and Lawton, which didn't suffer comparable disasters, grew to 5 and 10 times Snyder's size. The tornado shaped Snyder's trajectory permanently. The fires of 1906 and 1909, destroying most remaining wooden buildings along Main Street, appear suspiciously timed. Were they related to tornado damage or independent events? The available sources don't specify causes, but structural damage from the tornado would have weakened buildings, loosened connections, created gaps where fire could spread easily. A stove fire or lightning strike that might have been contained in a sound building could destroy one already compromised. Insurance companies in 1906 would have assessed Snyder as high risk after the tornado. Premiums likely increased, making reconstruction expensive. Some building owners might have faced incentives to let marginal structures burn rather than pay for repairs. This is speculation, but it fits frontier economic reality. The transition to brick construction after these fires was practical. Brick doesn't burn. It resists wind better than wood. It signals permanence and investment. The brick buildings that replaced Snyder's wooden core were statements. This town intends to last. These investments will not be destroyed by the next disaster. Whether this confidence was justified is debatable, but the intent was clear. The Kiowa legend about a prior tornado on Snyder's site cannot be verified, but it raises questions about indigenous weather knowledge and white settler dismissal of that knowledge. The Kiowa lived on the southern plains for at least a century before 1901. They experienced countless tornadoes, developed survival strategies, accumulated observations about where tornadoes struck and when. Whether they specifically warned about Snyder's site or whether that story was invented post-disaster to emphasize white foolishness is unknowable, but the pattern is broader. Indigenous peoples across North America possessed detailed environmental knowledge that white settlers routinely dismissed as superstition or scare tactics. The Kiowa knew southern plains weather. They knew tornado seasonality, formation patterns, likely paths. They adapted by living in portable structures and dispersed settlements. When they told white settlers that permanent concentrated towns on exposed sites were dangerous, they were sharing hard-won survival knowledge. The settlers, confident in their superior civilization and technology, built anyway. The tornado proved the Kiowa right. The phenomenon of victims being drawn back by the suction and cast aside reflects tornado vortex physics that observers in 1905 couldn't explain. Modern understanding of tornado structure clarifies this. A tornado's rotating column creates low pressure at its center. Air rushes inward to fill this low pressure, creating inflow winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. These inflow winds pull objects toward the tornado, but the tornado itself is moving forward at 30 to 40 miles per hour. Objects caught in the inflow are pulled toward the vortex, then caught in the rotating winds, then flung outward by centrifugal force. Depending on where objects enter the vortex relative to its forward motion, they can be deposited behind, beside, or ahead of their starting point. The multiple reports of victims found behind where their houses stood suggest they were caught in the rear inward flow, pulled into the vortex, and ejected backward relative to the tornado's path. This scattered victims over a wider area and made search and rescue more difficult. Survivors didn't know where to look. Bodies could be hundreds of yards from where their homes had stood, in directions that didn't match the storm's track. The medical response's limitations expose frontier healthcare's inadequacy. Multiple doctors arrived by train, which sounds impressive until you consider what they could actually do. Wound cleaning with water and carbolic acid, splinting broken bones, stitching lacerations, morphine for severe pain, whiskey for lesser pain. That was essentially it. Internal injuries went undiagnosed. Bleeding that couldn't be seen continued. Infections would develop over days. Shock killed people hours or days after injury. The 150 injured represents those alive when counted, probably on May 11 or 12. Some of those 150 likely died in the following weeks. Were they added to the death toll? Probably not, unless someone was systematically tracking tornado-related deaths. Once relief trains left and normal life resumed, deaths from complications might have been recorded as general medical deaths rather than tornado deaths. This would further undercount the true toll. The relief train system deserves more attention as frontier infrastructure in action. Within hours of word reaching Hobart, trains were moving. This required telegraph coordination among multiple station agents. It required railroad officials authorizing special trains outside normal schedules. It required communities organizing supplies, recruiting volunteers, gathering medical personnel. It required engineers and firemen willing to run unscheduled trains through the night. All of this happened through distributed decision-making with minimal central coordination. Station agents in Hobart, Frederick, Chickasha, Oklahoma City all made independent decisions to send aid. They didn't wait for territorial government orders. They acted based on shared understanding that when disaster struck, communities helped each other. This mutual aid culture was essential to frontier survival. The territorial government couldn't maintain disaster response teams in every county. Communities had to respond themselves and hope for mutual support. Snyder received that support because other towns knew they might need the same help someday. The carload of coffins from Oklahoma City represents a grim but necessary detail. Bodies needed burial within days in May heat. Snyder's local undertakers, if they survived, couldn't handle 120 deaths. They didn't have the coffins, the preparation supplies, the storage capacity. The Funeral Directors Association, meeting in Oklahoma City when news arrived, immediately grasped the need. Hal Street's call for volunteers produced 10 undertakers willing to drop everything and take a special train to Snyder. They brought a carload of coffins, likely 50 to 100 caskets, enough for known deaths plus anticipated additional discoveries. This professional response solved a critical problem. Without coffins, bodies would have been wrapped in canvas or blankets and buried in mass graves by necessity. With coffins, families could bury their dead with dignity, individual graves. Funeral services. The undertaker's work in Snyder probably continued for a week or more, preparing bodies, conducting services, coordinating burials. Their contribution to community recovery was essential, even if not as dramatic as the doctor's work. The Territorial Engineering Corps under Captain King provided military organization to chaos. Their exact role remains unclear in surviving documents, but references to maintaining order, clearing debris, and coordinating recovery work suggest they functioned as emergency management before that concept existed. Military discipline and organization were the territorial government's most effective disaster response tools. Civilian authorities in Snyder were dead, injured, or traumatized. The Engineering Corps arrived with command structure, chain of command, ability to organize large numbers of volunteers, experience in logistics and construction. They probably directed debris removal from streets, established priorities for reconstruction, prevented looting, maintained security, coordinated food and supply distribution. Their presence allowed civilian recovery to begin in an organized manner rather than devolving into chaos. The total death toll from the May 10, 1905 tornado outbreak, counting all tornadoes across Oklahoma Territory that day, approached 130. The Snyder tornado killed 97 to 120. The earlier Greer County tornado killed 9 or 10. The Elk City and Quinlan tornadoes killed 5 combined. This outbreak ranks among Oklahoma's worst multi-tornado days. The meteorological conditions were classic for major outbreak. Oklahoma Territory's sparse population was the only factor preventing higher death tolls. At 8:45 p.m. on Wednesday, May 10, 1905, a tornado struck the town of Snyder, Oklahoma Territory. It killed at least 97 people, likely 120 or more. It destroyed 100 homes completely and damaged 150 others. It injured 150 people. It devastated a town's economy and infrastructure. It left demographic scars visible a century later. It ranks as the second deadliest tornado in Oklahoma history. It represents the reality of frontier life stripped of mythology. Vulnerable people in vulnerable structures facing forces they could not predict, avoid, or survive. The roaring from the southwest, The rain and hail, the ominous calm, the 3 minutes of wind, the darkness and wreckage. The bodies covered in black slime. The mass grave at Fair Lawn Cemetery. The 34 unknowns. These are not footnotes. These are the story. May 10th, 1905. 3 minutes, 120 dead. The second worst tornado in Oklahoma history struck a town barely 3 years old, reduced its population by 10 to 12%, scattered its dead across muddy fields, buried 34 as unknowns, and continued northeast into the darkness over the prairie. The town rebuilt in brick. The school teams are called the Cyclones. The railroad still runs through. 1,500 people live there now, about the same as before the tornado. The mass grave marker commemorates what happened. 2 buildings survive as witnesses. Everything else is gone, replaced, rebuilt. The tornado took 3 minutes. The counting took weeks. The rebuilding took years. The memory remains, encoded in census figures and cemetery stones, and the persistent demographic scar of a town that never quite recovered its pre-disaster trajectory. This is what the settlement of Oklahoma Territory looked like, stripped of romance and myth. Snyder on May 10, 1905. The worst visitation of nature ever visited upon that particular rural population. Worse than war, which is hell. The roaring from the southwest. The 3 minutes. The 97 to 120 dead. The unknowns buried at Fair Lawn, the slow rebuilding, the permanent scar, the documented reality.